There were 10 of us, a strange mix of college friends, co-workers, and a couple of their tag-along siblings who'd insisted on joining at the last minute. The idea had started out simple enough. One of those overly ambitious plans hatched in a group chat late at night. Someone had found a remote stretch of forest, promising untouched trails, stunning views, and a chance to really disconnect. By the time the morning of the trip arrived, the excitement had dulled into a kind of stubborn determination. Our group was far too large, carrying mismatched camping gear. Everything from the latest hiking gadgets to old, beat-up coolers that rattled with loose bottles. But despite the chaos, we were in high spirits, laughing as we set off down the overgrown trailhead. The first leg of the journey was peaceful, almost idyllic. The sun hung low in a cloudless sky, casting long golden beams over the rolling fields of tall grass we passed through. The fields stretched out for miles, dotted with clusters of wildflowers and the occasional weathered tree bent against the wind. The grass was so tall in some places that it brushed against our elbows, whispering softly with every breeze. A little ways ahead, Devin, her younger brother, took the lead, kicking at stones and pretending to forge a path like some seasoned explorer. He wasn't even looking at the map. "This place is ancient, right? People say weird stuff happens out here," he called back, grinning mischievously. "Missing hikers, unexplained noises, Bigfoot sightings." He smirked, clearly enjoying himself. "Bigfoot's not even real," Maria shot back. "Say that to the guy who took those footprints they found last year. They're probably the size of your head." Devin raised his hands to mimic claws, making her roll her eyes. As silly as it sounded, the mention of Bigfoot sparked a low ripple of unease through the group. It was the kind of harmless folklore that you laugh about in the daylight but can't quite shake once the sun goes down. The fields began to thin out as the afternoon wore on, giving way to the edge of the forest. The change was subtle at first, just scattered clusters of trees and the faint smell of pine. But as we continued, the trees grew denser, taller, and darker, their tangled branches blocking out more and more of the sunlight. "We should stop soon," someone said. I think it was Greg, the quiet guy who had been lugging the heaviest backpack. "We'll want to set up camp before it gets dark." After some debate about whether we'd walked far enough to really be in nature, we finally agreed to settle in a small clearing just inside the forest. The ground was uneven, with patches of moss and exposed roots, but it was flat enough to pitch our tents. Setting up camp was chaotic but fun. Maria struggled with her tent poles until Devin took over, showing off his self-proclaimed engineering genius. Megan and I scavenged for firewood while the others unpacked supplies. The clearing came alive with the sounds of rustling fabric, snapping twigs, and the occasional burst of laughter. By the time we got the fire going, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in deep shades of gray. Shadows stretched out long and sharp, flickering around us in the firelight. We ate, drank, and swapped stories late into the evening. Most of them were harmless, the kind of stories that keep people laughing rather than looking over their shoulders. But as the night deepened, the laughter grew quieter, replaced by a hushed sense of comfort in the crackling fire and the distant rustle of the trees. I don't remember when the first sound came, but I know it was small, subtle. It was just a faint crunch in the distance, like someone stepping on dry leaves. "Probably just an animal," Greg muttered when Maria froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the dark trees. But the crunch came again, closer this time. "Deer, maybe," Megan whispered, but her voice wavered. We all turned toward the sound, squinting into the dark. The trees were thick, their shadows merging into an impenetrable wall. But for just a moment, I thought I saw movement. A flash of something pale weaving through the black trunks. "Hello!" Devin called out. A loud snap cut him off, the sound so sharp it echoed through the clearing. "Okay, not funny," Maria said, her voice rising in panic. "Maybe it's just the wind," Greg offered, but no one answered. The firelight seemed smaller now, swallowed by the endless dark. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves felt deafening. The kind of sounds you don't notice until you're desperately trying to listen for something worse. And then we heard it. A low, guttural noise that wasn't the wind. It was deep, almost a growl, but not quite. It sounded too deliberate, too heavy, like it was coming from something far too large to be lurking in the shadows. "Get in the tents," someone hissed, but none of us moved. Instead, we just stood there, frozen, staring into the black woods and waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. None of us slept that night, after the growl, if that's what it was. We sat huddled in a circle around the dying fire, too scared to leave it but too afraid to add more wood and risk attracting attention. The forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to avoid the clearing, leaving the tall pines unnaturally still. We whispered nervously, debating what to do. Devin, ever the loudmouth, had grown uncharacteristically quiet, his bravado drained away. Maria clung to his arm, her face pale in the flickering firelight. Megan wouldn't stop glancing at the trees, flinching at every small sound. "Maybe it's a bear," Greg said finally, breaking the silence. He was whispering, though I don't know why. It's not like it mattered how loud we were. Bears growl, right? That's probably all it was. "Bears don't stalk people," Maria shot back, her voice shaking. "Could have just been an echo," Greg insisted, but he didn't sound convinced. No one was. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we were exhausted but relieved. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving us huddled under thin blankets for warmth. As soon as it was light enough to see, we agreed to pack up and leave. But as we started breaking down the tents, Megan gasped. "Wait," she whispered, pointing to the edge of the clearing. At first, I couldn't see what she was looking at, but then I noticed it. A long, deep mark etched into the dirt, like someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. The trail started just beyond the clearing and disappeared into the forest. "What is that?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible. Greg crouched to get a closer look. As we looked closer, we saw strange impressions in the dirt, like footprints but far too large to belong to any of us. They were spaced out unevenly, the steps long and heavy. "Okay, I'm officially freaked out," Devin said, grabbing his pack and slinging it over his shoulder. "Let's go." No one argued. We left the clearing in a hurry, barely bothering to check if we had everything. The trail back through the woods felt longer than I remembered, the shadows deeper. And that's when we started hearing it again. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of leaves behind us. "Don't look back," Maria whispered, her hand clutching my arm. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of the trees behind us. There was something moving between the trunks. A tall, pale figure, its shape distorted by the shifting shadows. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but it was walking upright, its movements unervingly smooth. "Keep moving," Greg said, his voice low but urgent. We picked up the pace, nearly running now, the sound of our footsteps blending with the crunching behind us. Every so often, I'd glance back, and every time the figure was still there, just far enough to be indistinct but close enough to keep pace. By the time we reached the edge of the fields, we were breathless and panicked. The tall grass looked different now, the golden stalks swaying in the breeze like they were alive. But there was nowhere else to go. "It's still following us," Megan panted, her face slick with sweat. I glanced back again, but this time, I didn't see anything. Just the dark wall of trees we'd left behind. "Maybe it's gone," Devin said, though he didn't sound convinced. We moved quickly through the grass, sticking close together. The field felt endless, the sun's warmth doing little to ease the growing tension. That's when I noticed the quiet. The breeze had stopped, and with it the rustling of the grass. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds at all except for our own labored breathing. And then I saw it. Standing at the far edge of the field, barely visible against the rising sun, was the figure. It was taller than I'd thought, at least 8 or 9 feet. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. "What the—" Maria started, but Devin grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. "Run," he said, his voice hoarse. We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted across the field, the tall grass whipping at our legs. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't look back. Not until we reached the parking lot where our cars were waiting, where the world felt normal again. When I finally turned around, the field was empty. We didn't leave right away. Even after we piled into the cars, hands shaking as we fumbled with keys and seatbelts, none of us seemed ready to turn the engines on. We just sat there in the cramped, stale air of the vehicles, staring out at the fields and the wall of trees beyond. "I saw it," Maria said finally, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That thing." "We all saw it," Devin muttered. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, though the car wasn't even running. "But what the hell was it?" No one answered right away. The weight of the question hung in the air, thick and oppressive. "It wasn't a bear," Greg said after a long pause. He was sitting in the back seat of the other car, his face pale and drawn. "It was too tall. It wasn't a person, either," Megan added from her spot beside him. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "People don't move like that. They don't just stand there like that." "Maybe it was a prank," Devin said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Some local weirdo messing with us." "Yeah? And how did this local weirdo make those marks in the clearing? Or leave footprints that size?" Maria snapped. Her usual composure was gone, replaced with a raw edge of fear. "That wasn't a prank, Devin. That thing followed us but didn't attack," Greg said, almost to himself. He was staring out the window, his brow furrowed in thought. "Why?" "I don't care why," Maria said sharply. "I just care that we're still here to talk about it." The conversation devolved into a tangle of voices, each of us trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Theories flew back and forth, each one more desperate than the last. "Some kind of animal nobody's discovered yet," Greg suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Animals don't stalk people like that," Megan countered. "A spirit, maybe?" Maria ventured hesitantly, her voice dropping. "Like some kind of guardian of the forest?" Devin snorted, though it came out more nervous than mocking. "A guardian that growls at you and drags stuff around in the dirt?" "Yeah, real protective." "Then what was it, Devin?" Maria shot back, her voice rising. "You've got all the answers, don't you?" "Stop it," I interrupted, louder than I intended. The bickering stopped immediately, all eyes turning to me. "Fighting isn't going to change what we saw. We need to focus on getting out of here. Away from whatever that was." There was a long silence as my words settled over the group. "Do we tell anyone?" Megan asked quietly. "The police? What are we supposed to say? Oh, hey, we saw a tall, creepy something in the woods? They'll think we're crazy. What if someone else goes out there?" Maria said. "What if they don't come back?" No one had an answer to that. The sun was higher now, its warmth doing little to ease the cold knot of fear in my chest. The world outside looked deceptively normal, as if the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. I glanced back at the tree line one last time, half expecting to see that figure watching us from the shadows. But the forest remained still. "Let's just go," I said finally, my voice weary. "We can figure out the rest later." One by one, the engines roared to life and we pulled out of the lot. No one spoke for the first few miles, the tension in the cars as suffocating as the silence. It wasn't until we were far from the woods, the fields reduced to a distant memory in the rearview mirror, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. But even then, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. It let us leave. Why? By the time we made it back to the outskirts of town, the fear had settled into something worse, a gnawing, restless unease that clung to us like a second skin. I thought being away from the forest would help, that the sight of traffic lights and convenience stores would bring back a sense of normalcy. But even surrounded by the familiar, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really safe. We stopped at a small diner just off the highway, too rattled to head home without grounding ourselves in something ordinary. The place was almost empty, just a couple of truckers hunched over mugs of coffee, but the fluorescent lights and the hum of a jukebox in the corner felt like a lifeline. The waitress took one look at us, mud-streaked, pale and wide-eyed, and raised an eyebrow, but she didn't ask questions. She just brought us water and menus and left us alone. For a while, no one said anything. We just sat there, staring at the laminated pages in front of us as if the weight of what we'd experienced could be drowned out by bad coffee and greasy food. It didn't work. "Okay," Maria said finally, breaking the silence. She set her menu down with a sharp slap, her hands trembling. "We need to talk about this." "What's there to talk about?" Devin muttered. He hadn't even opened his menu, just stared blankly out the window. We all saw the same thing. We all know it wasn't normal. End of story. End of story? Maria's voice rose, drawing a glance from the waitress. She lowered it again, leaning in. "That's not the end of anything. Something was out there, Devin. Something that followed us, that—" "Let's not do this here," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. Maria glared at me but didn't argue. Instead, she leaned back in the booth, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Megan, who had been staring at her water glass like it held answers, finally spoke up. It wasn't just the figure, or the growl, or the footprints. It felt wrong, didn't it? Like the whole forest was watching us. Greg nodded slowly. "Yeah, like it wanted us to know we weren't supposed to be there." Devin shook his head, laughing bitterly. "So what are we saying? That it was what? Some kind of guardian spirit? Bigfoot? A ghost? You guys are acting like we walked into an episode of The X-Files." "No," Megan said softly, "but it wasn't just an animal either. You know that." I stayed quiet, my mind replaying the events over and over. The sounds, the marks in the dirt, the figure in the field, and that suffocating, primal feeling of being watched. "It let us go," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Everyone turned to look at me. "Think about it," I continued. "It could have done something. It followed us, sure, but it never crossed the line." "So what? It was just trying to scare us off?" Greg asked. "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Maybe it just wanted us gone. Or maybe it's still watching," Maria said, her voice tight. She wasn't looking at any of us, her gaze fixed on the salt shaker in front of her. A heavy silence fell over the table. The waitress came by again, her smile a little too forced. "Y'all ready to order?" None of us were.